Does anybody else know? Okay, cool, that's interesting. So the headroom on the budget that was announced on Wednesday was £9 billion. Now, that might sound like quite a big figure. Actually, that's the smallest headroom there's been on any budgetary forecasts, other than last spring's budget by the same Jeremy Hunt. So the average headroom on our forecast has been about £26 billion. So a £9 billion headroom is pretty small, particularly when you look at some of the estimates and changes and things that we've got on the horizon and some of the assumptions that underpin that budget. And one of the key assumptions is obviously around public spending. And so every few years, the government does what's called a spending review, and it works out how it's going to allocate its budget between the various departments. The last spending review was actually in October 2021. And that covered up until the current year, 24-25. And the government announced that actually they're not planning to do another spending review until after the general election. So if you look at the next 5-year forecast, and the OBR did this fascinating graph when they did their commentary on the budget, the first year, 24-25, you've got your spend allocated out between all the government departments. For the next 4 years in that 5-year plan, you've just got a total assumed spend. So you've got these big grey blocks on your bar chart with absolutely no detail as to how those are going to be allocated out across the departments. And I think that's really interesting context for some of the detail today. Certainly as accountants, if any of my clients came to me and said, oh, this is what I'm going to spend in total, but I'm going to come back to what I'm going to spend it on or what that's going to look like, I definitely have some challenges around that being a reasonable basis for kind of forecasting and budgeting into the future. So I thought that was just interesting context to share for some of the detail that we've got this morning. And I think as a result of that, then, the OBR have said they've given their view, obviously, on the budget and some of these forecasts. And one of the main objects of the budget is for GDP, for our net debt to fall as a percentage of GDP. And that's the key target which they've kind of announced. And the OBR have come out and said, well, we think the likelihood of achieving that target is 54%. And they actually then went on to say, well, that's a 46% chance of not achieving it, just in case anyone wasn't familiar with the maths, which was helpful. But it did seem that they were kind of reiterating the point there about the extent of some of the assumptions and forecasts which are built into this plan. So I thought that was kind of useful context this morning. Hopefully I haven't completely depressed the room. Apologies, Amanda. So I will pass over to Amanda and then Tom. And like I said, there will be opportunity for questions at the end.
Good morning, everyone. Lexi and I were talking earlier, and she actually said to me about those percentages, and my reaction was, well, that's good. It's more than 50%. So we are going to try and put positives onto anything we talk about today. So, how many people in this room actually watched the entirety of the Chancellor's speech? Well done, well done. How many people fell asleep halfway through? Well done. My colleague Rebecca and I sat in our conference room and we felt the same way. Now, I was expecting the budget to be fairly mundane, and I used mundane, not boring. We know that this is a budget before an election, and we'd had a few of the announcements already leaked a couple of days beforehand, so I wasn't expecting very much from it. However, after about 50 minutes, things started to get a little bit more exciting, and that's when, in quite a short space of time, he announced a number of changes. Now, those changes are what Tom and I are actually going to run through in more detail a little bit later on. But before we do, I always like to set the scene a little bit. So to run through the UK economy. Now, most of you know I do like to put a positive spin on things, so we are, wherever we can, going to show the positives. So I'm going to start with inflation. Now, a number of sessions ago when we've done these, I would not have used inflation as a positive. However, today I'm going to. So our inflation rate at the moment stands at 4%. Now, when you think back at the end of 22, our inflation rate was over 11%. That's quite a big drop in a reasonably short space of time. Now, when you also think that actually our inflation rate for more than 6 months was over 10%, it's actually come down quite quickly. Now, what you'll also see on that graph is that I've shown the forecast. So the Office for Budget Responsibility, they are an independent office for analysing the UK economy. So they are the ones that we look at for these future forecasts. Now, as a positive, the OBR are actually saying that over this first quarter, we're going to achieve an inflation rate of 2%. Now, that's the magic golden 2%. And moving forwards, looking at that longer-term forecast, our inflation is due to bump around that 2% level. Now, why do I call it the magic or golden 2%? Because that's the target that our government are trying to achieve. Now, they consider that 2% inflation is the optimum rate of inflation for the UK economy, which is why we are looking to achieve the 2% rate. So how have we actually achieved this drop in inflation? There have been a number of things, but one of the key tools that's been used is the bank base rate. Now, I look at this chart, and I've got to admit, the first thing I see is a roller coaster at Blackpool. Now, if anyone's been on the rickety old roller coaster at Blackpool, then you'll know that it's quite bumpy, and it does pretty much what that graph does. The only thing we can't see is at the end of the roller coaster, what happens. Now, what we can see from this graph is that our base rate has gone up over a reasonably short space of time. There's 13 increases in a 20-month period. We started to see the first one back in December 21, and then we reached 5.25% in August last year. Now, it's been at 5.25% since August, and that's the longest period of stability for the base rate since before December 21. Now, that's quite a lot to handle. But the one thing this doesn't actually show is how steep and how quick that's happened in comparison to a longer graph. If I took this back to 2009, you would see that between 2009 and December 21, that base rate bumped along around the 0.5%. So that's a very long period of time where we see it going flat. And then in a short space of time, it went up to 5.25%. Now you'll see that I've put at the bottom, future rate. Now I'm pretty certain we'd all like to see a little bit of a fall. Now that does depend whether you're a saver or whether you've got borrowings. But if you have a look at the OBR forecasts or any of the information actually on the Bank of England website, you will see that they are anticipating that to fall to 3.25%. And a lot of the wording does actually indicate that we may see a drop even in the current year. Now, the one thing that the Bank of England have got to be very careful of is that they don't want to go too quickly or too slowly with anything they do. One, so that we don't stifle inflation, because we don't want to go too far below the golden 2%. And also, we don't want to go too quickly where we go back to the higher rates of inflation. So has the Bank of England achieved their goal in relation to inflation? Now, if I was clever enough, I would be able to superimpose the base rate over the top of the inflation graph. I couldn't do it yesterday, but if we remember what it looked like, inflation came down, base rate went up, all right? So the one thing that the government tasked Bank of England with is to control that inflation rate, and that's what they've been doing. So, moving on. Let's have a look at growth. Now, for all those people that put their hand up that said they watched the budget, how many times did he mention about growth? How many times do we hear about it in every speech that both Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, and now Jeremy Hunt has said? Why? Why is growth so important? Well, every time that I've stood up here and when I've been listening to budgets, I always think, how are we going to pay for any spending cuts or increases in budgets? And I look at it and I think, well, I can see money going out. Where's that money coming in? If you look back over the last 5 years, then growth is crucial for our current government plans. The way they look at it, 10% of £100 is good, but 8% of £200 is better. Now that's, from everyone's perspective, we think, oh, 8% is better than 10%. But from their perspective, if they can achieve the £200, that's how they're going to get their extra revenue to pay, firstly, for that cut and for any increases in public budgets. So how are we doing in relation to our growth? Sluggish? Could we say that about last year? So for 2023, you will see it is positive, but only just. So we did have growth last year, but it was only at 0.1%. Now, you'll see I've put some comparisons to what they were forecasting. Now, the prior year's forecast for 2023 was a little bit above our actual. But if you go back to the previous forecast, there was at one point a thought that we were going to have negative growth last year. And as you all know, we had a couple of blips last year, which is why, in some ways, I'm going to put a positive. We did get a little bit of growth. The forecast for 2024, we're expecting growth to be 0.8%. Now, one thing I will say, normally with the OBR, their forecasts are often pessimistic. So, fingers crossed, we might achieve better than that. The longer term forecast, as you can see from that graph, it bounces around with growth at just under 2%. And that's what the OBR have put into their forecasts in terms of growth. So in some ways, this is a positive. We are seeing growth. As you know, I do like to cover debt and borrowing. And I can put a positive spin on this as well. Now, our public sector net debt, which is something Lexi was mentioning. So a fiscal policy is for our public sector net debt to reduce as a percentage of GDP. Now, for the term of this forecast, they are expecting that that will be achieved by the end of the forecast. There are a couple of variations during that time, but I think the peak should be 23-24, where our public sector net debt amounts to 97.9% of our GDP. That's pretty much a 100% mortgage, which I know from anyone who works in the banks wouldn't be allowed. That is going to drop. So you think, oh, that's good. Does that mean our debt's going to drop? No, it's just that our GDP is going to grow at a faster rate than our debt's going to grow. Hence, you can see why growth is so important for the current government. Now, I'm going to give another positive. If you actually have a look and compare our public sector net debt to GDP to the rest of the world, there are other advanced economies that are a lot worse than ours. USA is higher, Spain's higher, and one of the highest is Japan. So what's our borrowing requirement? So for the current year, our borrowing requirement is 114 billion. Good thing, this is a little bit lower than they thought it was going to be. It's at 5% of our GDP, and the forecast is saying that we will continue to need to borrow in every year of the forecast, so that's the next 5 years, but our total borrowing requirement per year is going to fall. So it's falling, that's good, but we're still borrowing. Now, our total debt, 2.7 trillion. Now, for anyone who was here last October, whenever we did it, that's the same figure. It's 2.7 trillion. And yet, we've added more to it. So why haven't I changed that number? Because it's so big. It requires a lot of billions to increase that 2.7 trillion. So on that 2.7 trillion, what are we paying? An awful lot of interest. So if you look at 23-24 interest, 94 billion pounds. Who wants to guess how much we spend on education? Throw out some numbers. 81 billion. Who thinks that maybe we should raise enough in corporation tax to actually pay for our interest? No, we don't. Corporation tax is less than what we spend on interest. Now, that's unfortunately a negative. But as you can see, the control of our debt and interest is crucial when looking at finances. Now that's enough of me saying negatives. Let's move on to exactly what he did say in the budget in terms of changes. Now the first one, we all heard about this actually before the Chancellor's speech, so it wasn't a surprise. However, I was sat there listening, got a little bit sidetracked because there was a lot going on, and then he started talking about national insurance. But the way he teed it up, I thought he was going to say that he was going to scrap it. And my colleague Rebecca will say, I got quite excited while he was talking about it, going, oh, he's going to get rid of it and we're going to see changes. No, he didn't do that. He did just cut the rate. So he cut the rate by 2%. So we've now got the employee's main rate of national insurance was cut by 2%, and this is on top of the 2% that he did last autumn. So our main rate is now 6% from this 6th April, and it's payable on earnings between 12,570 and 50,270. Now, we still got an upper rate, and the upper rate is at 2%, and it's payable on anything over about 50,270. So what he didn't do is he didn't change employers' national insurance. So our employers' national insurance is still at 13.8% on all earnings above £9,100. But he didn't forget the self-employed, and he also cut the Class 4 national insurance by 2%, and that's on top of the 1% that he did last autumn. So our rates for national insurance are 6% from this 6th April, and that's on profits between 12,570 and 50,270. Now, there's an upper rate again for Class 4, and once again, that's at 2%. And I've just put a little note at the bottom of that slide to say, no, don't forget, last autumn, Class 2 was abolished. So Class 2 national insurance is something that the self-employed paid. It's at a weekly rate, and it's always been there so that you could accrue your government benefits, mainly the state pension. That's going to be abolished from this 6th April, but you will continue to accrue benefit where your profits are above a certain level. So what else do you do? How many people in the room have got a furnished holiday let? No one's zoning up. I'm sure we've got more than one. So who noticed? He's going to abolish the tax regime for furnished holiday lets. Now, it was labelled up as the favourable tax regime for furnished holiday lets. So what we've got at the moment is if you run a furnished holiday let, and there are specific criteria for it to be a furnished holiday let, you have one set of rules that you follow, and they are probably a little bit better than those where you're running a longer term rent. The Chancellor said that actually, no, we're going to level the playing field, and so we're going to abolish that furnished holiday let tax regime. Now, the only word I've put up there is how. And the reason I put that is because I was reading through all the papers thinking there's bound to be some further information. This change for a lot is actually to be quite complex in how do you transition from a furnished holiday let to a normal rental. There's no information out there. They've just said that they will legislate over the summer. So we don't know. Wait and see. It's quite a short period, so this is coming in from next April. So we've only got 12 months to get our head around it. If we don't have the legislation until the summer, we'll have to look at planning later this year. So watch this space. As another thing that he's going to abolish is the non-UK domiciled rules. Now, there are probably many people in this room that think, well, what are they? We've probably heard of them, and we probably know of them as thinking they're a little bit beneficial for those people who aren't domiciled in the UK. And yes, they have been over the years. We're going to see them abolished from next year. there was a little bit more information on this side, and we're going to move to a residence regime. Now, what that means is that anyone who was non-resident that then comes to the UK, they're going to be able to elect to pay tax solely on their UK income for the first 4 years that they're here in the UK. After that, they'll be taxed on worldwide income and gains. If they do elect, then they lose their personal allowance and their capital gains tax annual exemption. Now, what I say, old rules were complicated. When I first heard the Chancellor say about it, I thought, ooh, that's going to be a lot simpler. The new rules are complicated. So, more work for Becky and I. What else did he announce? VAT. Now, as he was going through, I was surprised at this. He's increased the registration threshold from 85,000 to 90,000, and the deregistration threshold will increase from 83 to 88. Why? It's a £5,000 change. I was surprised. He did give a reason for saying it was a barrier for people at 85. It's a barrier at 90, it would be a barrier at 80. So I couldn't really understand why he'd done that, but it seemed to be just a throw-in. Now, the other thing that he went through very quickly was that on full expensing, and this is a capital allowance item, some of you may remember that full expensing was brought in as permanent. And this is something for businesses where you acquire new plant and machinery. You can offset the cost against your profits in the year that you incur the expenditure. This has been widened so that it covers leased assets. For many, it won't make a huge amount of difference because on top of full expensing, we still have things like annual investment allowance, as well as still having our writing down allowances. So it might not make too much difference for most of the people in the room. What didn't he say? Did anyone notice anything about corporation tax? No, he didn't say anything about it. Now, the reason he didn't is because we've seen some changes in corporation tax and now they're starting to settle down. So our corporation tax rates, 25% as a main rate and 19% small company rate. Now, for individuals, how many people are bored of me saying that the personal allowance and thresholds were frozen? They continue to be frozen, and our personal allowance is £12,570 until 2028. That's still a little way off. Higher rate threshold, frozen at £50,270, again until 2028. How many people had remembered that the additional rate threshold had actually dropped last year? It's gone down to £125,140. How many people remembered that the dividend allowance has changed? It wasn't that long ago the dividend allowance was £2,000. For this year, £1,000. Next year, dropping to £500. Who wants to take a bet that that could drop again? Okay. Tax rates. I love being able to stand here and say that our main tax rates, 20%, 40% and 45%, and they haven't changed for a long time. It's really nice to have something that's stable. Dividend income. Now that went through a bit of a change a few years back, and our dividend rates are very hard to remember, because we've got 8.75% for dividends falling in the basic rate band, 33.75% where they fall into the higher rate, and 39.35% on additional rate. And then at the bottom, just one thing to add in, pensions. So from 6th of April last year, our annual allowance did go up. Now, he hasn't changed that again in any way, so our annual allowance is £60,000. The rate at which that is tapered went up last April, and that went up to 260,000. And don't forget that the pension lifetime allowance has been abolished. So, what should we be looking out for over the next year? General election. I think everyone knows and probably expects that when we stand up this time in either autumn or this time next year, I would anticipate things changing. How they're going to change, we don't know, and that's what makes it so hard to plan. I've actually had a number of clients come up to me and say, do you think I should do anything before the election? Historically, when we were in this situation, you'd have a bit of a feel for it. This time, no. And the difficult part is whatever we see in any manifesto doesn't always translate to actual changes. So doing anything now could be detrimental, and you may not be able to unwind it, but we just don't know, which makes it difficult to actually plan ahead. But I suggest that everyone just keeps listening to what's going on, and we'll have to see what comes out. Now, on that note, I'm going to hand over to Tom. Thank you very much. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Right, see if that works. Oh, yes, excellent. Try not to stand in the light, because you'll see my grey hair. Right, here we go. Right, so let's start with a bit of background. Amanda's obviously given you the summary, but these are some of the things that sort of leapt out at me. We had the confirmation that, technically at least, there was a recession last year. For those of you who don't know, it means that the economy shrank for 2-3 month period in a row. But just as they announced it, they said, we're probably already out of it. So don't worry about it. There we go. Inflation, as Amanda said, has been such a key issue. It's basically been, since we started doing these in person, it's basically been the big issue. I remember me and Amanda standing here and sort of thinking, wow, it might go up to 10%. And everyone sort of laughed and we couldn't believe it. Well, 11.1% in August 2020. But it's down now, 4% in January. Last time we were here, it was 4.6. So Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt will say it's going in the right direction. Core inflation, though, it means that that's on the things that we actually buy, the genuine things that people notice. That's apparently at 5.1%. So, you know, maybe it's still got some way to go. As Amanda said, target's 2%. Interest rates have gone up, but as Amanda said, they've been stable for a while. But the government's saying they might drop them later this year. Well, we'll wait and see. Anyway, that's the background. What did they actually change? Let's have a look. Capital gains tax. So just a reminder, before the budget, this is what it looked like. Capital gains tax paid on the disposal proceeds when you sell an asset, give it away, paid at 18 or 10 or 28% on residential property, or 10 or 28% on everything else. So payable when you sell something. The rate depends on the income tax you receive. So standard rate up to £50,270. Anything above that, you pay the higher rate. So when we were here last time, or in fact, when we were here for the budget last year, there was lots of rumours they were going to put the rate up because historically the rate matched income tax. So people are thinking, is this going to go back? Are going to put the rate up? Like Amanda saying, lots of people saying, should we sell these things before the budget? Should we do something? Actually, what they did was cut the allowance. They didn't put the rate up. They sort of put the rate up by not putting the rate up and cutting the allowance. So it's a rather backwards going forward type arrangement. But what did they do on Wednesday? Well, they cut the rate on residential, the higher rate, from 28% down to 24%. Standard rate stays the same, still at 18%. The principal private residence relief, so the relief that all of us would pay if we sell our house, that stays the same, still in place. The residential rate was only introduced in 2016, 2017, and this is the first time it's been cut. So this is a bit of a change. It's very rare that they cut rates, but they did so on Wednesday. And I'll read you a quote, because I think this is quite illuminating. So, said, this will encourage landlords and second homeowners to sell their property, making more available for a variety of buyers, including those looking to get on the housing ladder for the first time, while also raising revenue over the forecast period. So, what's the meaning behind that? Why is he trying to get to? Well, as we all know, there's not enough houses being built, so there's not enough housing being sold. So this is Jeremy Hunt's attempt to put more energy in the housing market, get more things available, encourage people to sell. He's not putting any more targets into housing, but he's trying to encourage people to sell, especially second homeowners. Excuse me, talked about. Sure. See if Lexi and I have the same shaped head. Yes, looks like we do. Sorry about that, everyone. So, trying to encourage second homeowners to sell by cutting the rate. Makes sense, doesn't it? It also is a reflection of the amount that homes that are being sold. So what does that mean in real terms? So if you're a second homeowner, you've got a property which has got a gain, so it's gone up in value by £200,000. You would have paid before, or you would pay today, before the 6th of April this year, you'd pay just over 55,000 of capital gains tax. This assumes you've got full annual allowance available. Afterwards, you'd pay just over 47,000. So you'd save nearly £8,000. So the real question is this going to be enough to incentivize people to sell? Maybe, we don't know. Jeremy Hunt is assuming that it will, because he predicts this is going to generate £70 million worth of tax this year, and then next year it's £310 million worth of extra tax, and then the year after £350 million worth of extra tax. So he's assuming, he's hoping that this is going to generate much more tax for the revenue. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Now, what is capital gains tax? How much of a big tax is it? Well, it's relatively small. I mean, we heard the sort of astronomical numbers from Amanda just now. It only generates, I say only, 17.8 billion for this year, this tax year. That's less than 2% of the total receipts. But crucially, and I think maybe this might be slightly more illuminating as to why he's cut the rates, this is down from 18.1 billion. For the last tax year. So despite the fact he's cut allowances, perhaps that's de-incentivized people from selling. So he's cut the rates to try and correct that and put it back on an even keel. It's projected to be 26.1 billion for the end of the forecast period. We've got 27, 28. So it is expected to go up. Right. So just a quick summary where that leaves us. As I said, a year ago, annual allowances were announced to be cut. They're now going to be £3,000 for an individual and half that for a trustee. So basically gone. So there's basically no allowances. If you think just a few years ago, that was over £12,000 per person. And the rates are 18 and 24% for residential property and 10 and 20% for everything else. So inheritance tax, I'm ploughing along. I always mention inheritance tax. Nothing ever comes up that's that exciting except to me, but I'm still going to mention it. I'm going to keep doing it till something comes up. So I apologise in advance, but it is what I do every day, so you forgive me. So they did make one change. So this is something that I imagine almost no one has heard about. But basically, when you need to get a grant of probate, you need a grant of probate in order to deal with someone's estate. Usually, you have to pay the tax, or at least a proportion of the tax, depending on the assets. But there is something called a grant on credit. It's basically, you can say to the revenue, I've got no option, I can't pay the tax for certain reasons. Can you basically allow me to get the grant so I can sell the assets to pay the tax? Now, this is only available, and this is the revenue's own words, the most exceptional circumstances. So basically, never. But they announced that they're relaxing the rules. Now, historically, you had to prove that you'd gone to all the banks and all the building societies and anyone you could, I don't know if they include loan sharks, but basically anyone, to say, I couldn't borrow any money, I couldn't do anything, and then they do it. They've scrapped that rule now. So you now don't have to demonstrate that you've gone to every bank and every building society and every loan shark before they will give you a grant on credit. Now, what does this mean? Is this going to become more prevalent? I don't know. I doubt it, to be honest. But it perhaps is a reflection of the delays. I can see some of my probate colleagues sat at the back. They will tell you that it now takes an astronomical amount of time to get a grant of probate. You're talking months, maybe a year. Back in the old days when I used to do probate work, it would be 10 days. You'd send it off, 10 days later you'd get it back. Great. Now you're talking about months. So that has a significant impact, not only on people's ability to pay the tax, but actually to deal with someone's estate. So if you have to wait, you send everything off, you get everything together, and you have to wait 10 months, a year, that's going to cause huge delays, obviously to us, the people dealing with it, but also for the people who are waiting for their inheritance. So is this a reflection? I don't know. I suspect it will stay and probably never be mentioned again. But anyway, grant on credit, it's got some attention today. There we go. So one other change they made to inheritance tax, again, this is something I've mentioned for the last few times, and every time I've said, well, they haven't really given any substance. Now, I wouldn't say they've given any substance now, but they've given a hint that they may give some substance later, or at least confirmation that they will give some substance by next year. So, as those of you who know, agricultural property relief is a relief against inheritance tax, basically for agricultural assets. So it appeals for farmers, landowners. But the rules haven't kept pace with the change in the subsidy system. So there's a new system, the change is made, basically it's focusing on setting land aside, letting it be rewilded, all those sorts of things. And the new system is called ELMS, so Environmental Land Management. But the reliefs that apply for inheritance tax, agricultural property relief, haven't followed suit, they haven't complied. Lots of pressure being put on by the RFU, the CLA, and all those sorts of people to say, well, come on, this is disadvantaging farmers who are following your new subsidy system. What can we do? Well, we've now got confirmation. I wouldn't say we've got detail, but we've got confirmation that agricultural property relief will follow ELMS. So basically, by next year, by next April, there will be more detailed legislation to say that it will follow the new system. So that's a bit of a relief. Certainly, the information from the CLA yesterday was pleased. They were satisfied with what they'd seen because they'd really been pushing this. So that's positive. Inheritance tax, just a quick reminder. Again, I feel like Amanda because it's reassuring to know that some things never change, and agriculture and inheritance tax is one of those things that hasn't changed. So it's still fixed, the threshold's still fixed until 2028. That means that since I was a trainee, since I was Stuart's trainee back in 2009, the nil rate band has stayed the same. It's still 325,000. So it's basically going to be 19 years. It will be fixed, which is an awful long time. So fiscal drag, it's a term we used a lot last time. It's something that I've seen a lot in the papers today and yesterday, talking about income tax, but this is just as significant, because if the nil rate band allowance had followed inflation and house prices, it should be over £100,000 higher than it is now, but it isn't. Stayed fixed back at the 2009 rates. So again, it's a relatively small tax, even smaller than capital gains tax. So why do I keep banging on about it anyway? I apologise, but it's only intended to produce 7.2 billion for this tax year, but that's up from just over 5 billion back in 2020. So these are the rates, still at 40%, as always was ever thus. Lifetime rate 20%, and if you give 10% to charity, only pay 36%. Right, those are the thresholds. We should all know them by now, shouldn't we? 325,000, residence allowance 175,000, and then so combined allowance for married couples 1 million. There we go, there's a graph of where it's going to be up in 2027. Continue to go up. Right, is it going to be a hot issue? I mean, there was lots in the press. I was speaking to Leighton beforehand, and we were both agreed that we were both a bit nervous that they might get rid of inheritance tax. I needn't have been nervous. Obviously, they didn't do that. But there's still questions being asked. There's still pressure being put from Conservative MPs on their own government to say we should scrap the allowance, we should get rid of it. So is it going to be an election issue? Are the Conservatives going to say in their manifesto, we'll get rid of it, and then Labour will have to respond? I don't know. I would be surprised. When I stood up here last time, I thought maybe there would be more lines drawn between the two. But I think the reality is Labour are going to do everything they can not to say anything at all. And the Conservatives might, if Wednesday's anything to go by, steal a few of their policies and put the pressure back on them. But one thing Labour have done since I stood up in front of you was that they have said they're not going to scrap agricultural property relief or business property relief. That was one of the things that was rumoured that they might do. They've said they won't. But obviously we don't have any manifestos yet, so we don't know for certain. Stamp duty land tax. So this is another change. So just to remind you what stamp duty land tax is, it's paid on consideration when someone purchases a property. There is something called multiple dwelling relief. So it's payable when you buy more than one property. It basically allows you, rather than paying all of the consideration, you're paying it on the mean average, but it's set at a minimum of 1%. So if you buy 4 properties, total £1 million, you pay it at 4 lots of 250 rather than the rate at £1 million. But unfortunately, it was being misused. There was lots of pressure to reform it or maybe to change it. Well, they didn't do those things, they scrapped it. So from the 1st of June 2024, it won't exist anymore. If you exchange beforehand, you still benefit from the old rules. But from the 1st of June, you now don't get that relief. Now, who's that going to affect? Well, it applies if you're purchasing 6 properties or less. So they're not big transactions. So I think it's really going to affect those people who are buying, multiple dwellings. So it might be a manor house, which has got, a gatehouse, or a property with a granny annex, or a farm that's got a couple of cottages. Those people will be affected. But if you're buying more than 6 properties, you wouldn't pay the residential rates anyway, so it won't affect those. So again, I think it's going to be people who are relatively small transactions who will really be impacted by this change. So the rates are there. I won't waste your time going through those. But what is it going to generate? Well, it's saying it's going to generate an extra 70 million next year, and then 220, and then 300 million. So a fair amount. So again, is this in response to a dip in revenue? Perhaps. When we had the house market was going absolutely bananas, SDLT generated 17.5 billion. So for the year to 2022, that was a lot. Whereas this year, it's only 12.6 billion. So it's down. So is this a way to try and address that? I don't know. All I'd say is the last time they tried to interfere with SDLT, it sent the market absolutely mad. So I hope we don't have a repeat of that. But there we go. Been changes to child benefits. For those of you who don't know, child's benefit parent of every child who's under 16 or under 20 in an education, £24 a week for one, £15.9 for extra children. You've got a rather strange situation where it's judged on just the income of the highest earning parent. So you can have a situation where two parents are earning 49,000, you're entitled to full child benefit. But if you've got one parent who's earning 51 and the others who's earning nothing, then you're not entitled to the full child benefit. So it's a very inequitable system. So what they've done, if they've changed that rate, it's gone up from 50 to 60,000, and they've also changed that tapering threshold. So this is called high income child benefit charge. So it's actually you pay an extra tax, but it's like a taper. So the more you earn over historically 50, the more you pay in this charge. They've changed that so tapering now goes up to 80,000. So it means that hopefully people who earn more will be able to still get more child benefit. What they have said, though, is they've committed, without any detail, to changing the system to a household system. So basically look at the income for both parents from 2026. So maybe that might address some of that more inequitable situation. What's it going to do, though? So there's lots of conversations last time. I remember we talked about the people out of work, people who aren't generating tax revenue for the economy. Supposedly, this change will take 150,000 families entirely out of that tapering and will generate for 485,000 families £1,260 per year, and it'll increase full-time working hours by 100,000. So it's not quite addressing that 8 million people that I heard yesterday who could work but aren't, but it's trying to do something. It's supposed to generate 0.2% for the economy. One final thing before I finish and hand over for questions. An extra ISA. For those of you who don't know, ISAs are tax-free savings accounts, so you basically don't pay income tax or capital gains tax. There's already 4. Cash ISA, stocks and shares ISA, innovative finance ISA, I hadn't heard of that one, I'll confess, or the lifetime ISA. Tax allowance is 20,000 a year, so basically you can put 20,000 in total over those 4 products. There's a lot of them. So back in 2022, there was 11 million was subscribed to, so it's a lot. So they've got a new one. It's called the UK ISA. Very few details, but it's basically an extra allowance on top of your 20,000. So you've got given an extra allowance. It's to invest in UK companies. Consulting at the moment on what exactly that means, and that consultation will close in June, and then it'll launch after that has been done. There we go. I've finished. Back to Lexi for some questions, and Amanda.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you. So I've got your mic now, but it's working, I think.
Oh,
Good.
it's just me.
Are there any questions for Tom or Amanda in the room? Oh, look at that. You've done such a great job. None at all. Do we have any at home, Richard, from anyone who's joined online? No? Not there either? Okay, here we go.
You touched on the allowances for furnished holiday lettings. Is this going to apply to limited companies as well? Will
Okay.
they be given the allowances?
I'll just repeat the question for the benefit of people at home. So it was in relation to furnished holiday lets, and will it apply to, this is going to Amanda, to companies as well?
Are you talking about the abolition of the furnished holiday let tax regime? As far as we know, yes. We haven't got any details yet, though, so I can't answer that definitively, but probably. Yeah.
Thank you. Stuart.
Yeah, in relation to the exciting prospect of a Starmer government, what's the latest that they've said about capital gains tax? Are they still going to line it up with income tax rates?
Okay, so again, I'll just repeat the question. Sorry, just for those at home. So it was in relation to a potential future Labour government. What have they said in relation to capital gains tax?
So as Stuart said, there were, I think it was more last time in the autumn statement, they were talking about, Labour I should say, were talking about putting the rate up back in line with income tax, where it's been historically. So historically, the two have followed each other. Very little detail before Wednesday, either way, and I think that's probably an indication of where we're going to go before the election. Labour are going to say nothing, and they're going to just hope that they don't make a mess of it. Obviously, they'll have to put something in their manifesto. So I suspect when they do, we will see. But it was interesting yesterday from the feedback after the budget, where both Conservatives and Labour got criticised basically for not talking about tax rises or spending cuts, because, as Amanda talked about, growth is so important, and the longer the can gets kicked down the road, the harder it is to generate growth, because borrowing is so high. So I think the answer is, Stuart, we'll have to wait for the manifestos, which might not be too long away, but I would be surprised if they would do something that significant. But if, as we've seen with the non-dom issue, if the Conservatives steal a few more policies from Labour, maybe Labour will have to reply and respond and try and find another way of generating some income.
Thank you. Perfect. Well, if there's no further questions, then I hope you'll all join me, firstly, in thanking the Racecourse for hosting us so well again this morning, Richard and all the team for their IT, and obviously Tom and Amanda for their fantastic presentations. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.